Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Alex Talk. I'm the director of the Tommy G. Thompson Center on Public Leadership and an associate professor of political science here at UW. And I'm really pleased to be moderating today's panel. I want to thank everybody involved in this. This has been terrific so far, and I think can only get better. So I think this panel is going to talk about the actual effects of fusion. So we've talked about history, we've talked about law, and some of that will come in here a little too. But here we want to really think about what realistically are the potential benefits of fusion, what are the potential downsides of fusion, just what would its effects be, and where it's existed in recent history, what have its effects been, and how does it interact with other reforms. So I think we have a great panel here. I'm going to give them just very brief introductions because I want to have as much time for the discussion as possible. So first, Lisa Dish is a professor of political science at the University of Michigan, where she specializes in political theory with research interests in feminist theory, political ecology, and representation. Dan Lee is an associate professor of political science at UNLV, where his teaching and research interests lie within American politics and political institutions, in particular parties, Congress, and congressional elections, and is published on the topic of fusion. Lee Drutman is a senior fellow in the political reform program at New America, and also a political scientist. He is the co-founder of Fix Our House, a campaign for proportional representation in the U.S., and a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University Center for Advanced Governmental Studies. Finally, Nate Atkinson is an assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin Law School, where his research interests lie in the design of legal and political institutions, including voting procedures. Right. So I think this is just a terrific panel covering that can cover a ton of aspects of this. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Lisa.
Hi, this is great. When we started doing work on fusion several decades ago, I really never imagined that there would be so much interest in it and that it could be something that many people, not just election nerds, would be interested in. So I would like to ask for a moment that you put out of your head everything you know about two-party politics, and that we look at the benefits of fusion from the perspective of the past, rather than through the lens of our perspective today. So I'm going to talk about what fusion meant to the 19th century parties that used it, and what it allowed them to do, what it made possible. We no longer enjoy the range of options that they took for granted. And I'm going to start by reading two quotes. And one of them is from a dean of election studies, as we say in the academy, Gerald Rusk. This is from a 1970 article. And he said, in the last 2 decades of political science, there has been considerable interest in the determinants of electoral behavior. And the determinants of electoral behavior are your religious identification, possibly your ethnicity, possibly your stand on something like temperance or reproductive choice. Virtually neglected in this search for determinants has been the institutional or structural properties of the electoral system itself. That is still true today. And the reason we are here is because we understand that the ballot and what appears on the ballot and how many choices you get to make on that ballot are a significant determinant of really our politics, of our democracy. Now, there is more awareness today of voter suppression, but there is still not a lot of attention to the ballot itself. So, and then I'm going to read you a quote from a Michigan populist, the end of the 19th century. He could have been a research assistant for Rusk, except they weren't alive at the same time. And he astutely laid bare what would be the result of fusion bans. And he saw how the construction of the fusion ban would interact with the Australian ballot law. So one of the things that the Australian ballot law did was it imposed a threshold for appearing on the ballot. And basically, the two dominant parties gave themselves automatic ballot status. That anyone who wasn't one of the two major parties had to get a certain number of votes on their ballot line in order to appear on the ballot the next time. So they would probably have to do a petition gathering thing to get themselves on the ballot in the first place, and then they needed to get a certain number of votes to appear again. And this Michigan populist said that the ballot qualification requirements plus the prohibition against double listing, which was what the fusion ban was. It was a candidate cannot appear twice on the ballot. I think Dave covered that really well. Would affect the People's Party's ballot status. And he said, whenever a fusion candidate running under the Democratic heading alone produced many stay-at-home votes, which it would do, populists wouldn't want to vote for their candidate under the Democratic heading alone. In the future, we, the populists, will still have to get on the ballot by petition. So that was going to hurt their status as an organization. And he continued, the legislation practically disfranchises every citizen who does not happen to be a member of the party in power. It would mean that there could only be two parties at one time. And this was a shock. This is what we take for granted. And what we take for granted is that the second major party has a monopoly on political opposition. And it should not be that way. And it does not need to be that way. So one thing I would love to do is ban the phrase two-party system, because two-party politics did not work the way it does today in the 19th century. And when we use that phrase, we lend a sense of inevitability to the limits that we confront today. And we shut down, or we make ourselves feel that a challenge to what is today is futile. So how different was politics in the 19th century? I'm going to say it really quickly. It was a period of political ferment and party fluidity. Rachel Sheldon and Eric Alexander have written beautifully about this, due largely to third political parties. And what did third political parties do? They made it so that dissenting voices need not align with one opposing party only, but they could find expression through usually two, maybe even three, third political parties. And it doesn't matter that those parties were ephemeral. They weren't all, some of them were. It doesn't matter. They changed the political agenda. That is something we are almost completely unable to do with our system. It really, you have to have some serious weight to change the topic of discussion and change the line of conflict. And it is very difficult for us to do that now. In the 19th century, voters were cross-pressured. They might have had they might have had a serious, or their political stance might have been seriously determined by whether they were an immigrant or not, whether they were a drinker, or a non-drinker who didn't want anyone to be drinkers, or a non-drinker who didn't mind if other people drank. All of these things affected it. I think that kind of diversity exists today, but two-party politics as it is manifest today tends to reduce rather than to solicit and encourage it. And fusion voting solicited and encouraged that kind of diversity. You are going to hear from Lee Drutman in a few minutes about the one-dimensionality of our politics, and that is exactly what fusion was able to fusion enabled multi-dimensional politics. So what did third political parties do in the 19th century? They were able to ask and answer questions like, what are we fighting about? What do we need to be fighting about? And maybe some people whom I perceived as being against me could be with me. In other words, they could build unprecedented and surprising coalitions. That is gone today, and that is dangerous for all of the reasons that Lily Mason said that it is earlier today.
I need to set a timer so I don't talk too much. I'm kind of glad I didn't prepare in a way today. I mean, I did, but didn't, because that way I can kind of adjust to what's been said and kind of fill some spots that might need to be covered. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to first start broad, kind of give you my general motivation for why I study third parties. So my research, that's kind of one area of my research agenda, studying third parties. Then I'm going to present kind of a general theoretical framework that I use to think about third parties. We'll apply it to fusion, and then we can actually apply it quickly to ranked choice voting, because I know that came up. And as a political scientist, I think we tend to have a bias towards being kind of conservative in terms of like adopting reform. So kind of my discussion is going to raise cautions about fusion voting, but I do want to end on a positive note. Something positive we could say more confidently about the positive effects of fusion. So my general motivation is like, do we really have a two-party system? Because I think it's been alluded to a few times how the parties have transformed a lot over, even though the identities, the names of the parties are the same, they've kind of evolved over time. So I think just using the term two-party system in that sense also is maybe not a good sense to think about. It's not really maybe it's like 2.1 or 2, because there's different versions of these parties. Then also thinking about it, for me, third parties play in the background in terms of being one of the factors that instigates changes among the major parties. So I think it more in terms of like a 2+ party system. Like it's not a multi-party system. It's not a straight 2-part. I always think about it like a 2+, right? So then we can think about, okay, so what influence do third parties have in this 2+ party system, right? So if we focus just on, do they win elections? Do they win office? They don't matter in that sense. But like my argument in a lot of my research is that they do matter all the time, even when they don't win elections, even when they don't even run. It's because of the potential threat of third parties causes the major parties to co-opt their potential supporters, right? So this whole co-optation dynamic is kind of like what my research theoretically focuses on, right? So the major parties have incentives to, I didn't even start this, so I guess I have 5 minutes still. I just start.
No.
They have incentives to try to co-opt the third parties, right? There's those potential votes, right, to help win an election, or the potential threat of a third party candidate might lead to a spoiler outcome if I don't preemptively, or if I don't try to win over their supporters, right? So I'm a Democrat, they vote for the Green Party candidate instead, I might lose the election because of the spoiler outcome, right? So my research looks at how the threat of third parties, like when third parties are more likely to run, they can have more of an impact, right? Again, not so much through winning elections, but through like scaring the major parties and leading them to try to co-opt those third party supporters, right? So let's think now in terms of fusion voting, right? So in terms of, okay, so we can think about co-optation. I think we'll hear next how we can think about multi-dimensional politics. Third parties can bring up new issues that are being ignored. But what I'm going to reference right now is research where I look at the unit dimensional, like this left-right continuum, right? And we think about this co-optation dynamic. So let's think about New York State, where pretty much most or all of the third parties, minor parties, tend to be at the ideological extremes rather than a moderate party, right? So if you have parties towards the extremes, if you have major party candidates trying to co-opt their supporters, they're going to go out towards the extremes to co-opt their supporters. And this is like kind of a concern that was brought up by Derek. It's not a given that fusion is going to lead to more moderate major party candidates, right? It's contingent on there being a moderate third party. So I have a paper, and all my work is theoretical and also empirical, looking at fusion voting, electoral fusion in New York State, and I look at congressional elections. So I study national politics, and basically we see that over time that fusion contributes to polarization, in that candidates polarize in order to win cross nominations, right? So over time, as the parties have become more polarized, the minor parties in New York State have increasingly cross nominated rather than using pure, minor party nominations. And then also comparing across districts, the more extreme congressional incumbents are the ones that are getting more of those cross nominations, right? So this is kind of the potential downside. So it, again, kind of depends on what you're trying to solve. If you're trying to solve polarization, fusion might not achieve that outcome. It's contingent on there being a centrist minor party, right? Then also just really quickly, I'll just do one more minute on ranked choice voting. So my general theoretical framework kind of applies to that too. So I would have given someone said like, why isn't this a conference on ranked choice voting? So if it were a conference on ranked choice voting, I would have given the exact same talk, right? So ranked choice voting. So how does it all work? So fusion voting helps minor parties because it avoids the wasted vote logic, right? I'm not going to waste my vote on someone with no chance of winning. So I can still vote for this fusion minor party candidate. Same thing with ranked choice voting. Like, why is that beneficial for minor parties? Well, I don't have to worry about wasting my vote because if I vote for them, they come in last place. We'll just go to my second rank and I can vote for the lesser of two evils on that ballot, right? So likewise there, that increases the likelihood of, successive third party candidates. That's going to increase pressures for major party candidates to co-opt their supporters, which again, if those are more extreme third party candidates, pull them towards the extremes, right? So again, these are just words of caution of like, what are the likely effects of fusion, of electoral fusion? I mean, it could potentially lead to contribute to polarization. I will say also though, that this is a general dynamic that happens everywhere, even places without electoral fusion, right? Because minor part or like interest groups could endorse candidates, right? So there's other co-optation dynamics that work out in other districts, like in other states without fusion. So it's not to say that electoral fusion is like going to necessarily make it more polarizing, like compared to this other dynamics, how it plays on other districts, other states. But my research suggests that it at least in the margins is going to contribute to it. On the positive side, again, it kind of depends what we mean, like what we're trying to solve. So I think the benefits of fusion have largely to do with like voter attitudes. So there's research that looks at, there's a survey experiment where, ranked choice voting just increases people's attitudes towards democracy, makes them just trust the election outcomes more so, right? So that's kind of like why I'm was it fusion curious, like kind of on the fence. Like it's kind of ambiguous for me because there are costs and benefits. So I just wanted to at least end on that positive note. All right, thanks.
All right, so now I have a clicker. All right, I'm going to show you all some pretty pictures. Okay, enough words. No, there's words too. All right, I'm going to actually start this timer. Okay, so here's a pretty picture. I think it's pretty. All right, what does this picture show? All right, so the x-axis is the presidential vote margin. That's the one on the bottom. The y-axis is the Senate vote margin. Okay, so look at 2000. That's crazy, right? There's all these Senate candidates who are running way ahead or way behind their president. If you look at the upper left-hand corner, you've got Republicans winning in Rhode Island and Vermont. If you look in the lower right quadrant, you've got Democrats winning in Nebraska and North Dakota and West Virginia, although actually that was a more Democratic state then, but still Republican. So that's really interesting. You have these, these factions within the party. Now look at 2024. These are Senate elections. Bam! That's the flattening of dimensionality that I'm talking about, right? Candidates no longer distinguish themselves from their presidential party. It's all just one dimension. Are you a Democrat or are you a Republican? That explains everything. And that's the problem that we're in right now. And this is what Dean Turkaji was talking about at the beginning. We're in trouble. because we've flattened everything down to a single dimension. So the factions, the possible opportunities for shifting coalitions, that has all vanished from our politics. And this is something new. This is something distinct. History moves one way. We're here now we're in 2025. Do I get another slide here? All right. Okay. For the statistics nerds here, this is the R squared between basically the correlation, and what you see is of the Senate races, and what you see is this is the flattening of dimensionality. Everything is along one dimension. Okay. What about the House? I just did 2016, 2020, and 2024. But look at 2024. That is an R squared of 0.98. That is a very high R squared for those of you who don't know statistics. That means almost perfect prediction. Now, again, flattening of dimensionality, it's just all partisanship. It's all one dimension, D versus R. That is really bad for democracy. Democracy depends on these cross-cutting coalitions that Lily Mason talked about earlier. Okay. Now, I'm not going to go into the methodology of how I created this decline, but basically what you see is a decline of competition. You see, these, I rank them in 5 tiers, Senate seats, but, most of the Senate races have become basically foregone. So you have very little competition. In the House, it's even worse. Okay. So what happens when you have no competition in almost all of the elections in the country? Yes, bad things. But because competition is really important, right? In an economy, if you don't have competition, you don't have innovation. You don't have dynamism. You just have things that are stuck and fight. And then there's this little sliver of elections. Few states, this one, Wisconsin, right? Just gets very nasty every election. You're just assaulted with negative advertising. Okay. So this is bad. Most people are in safe districts that are either solidly Democratic or solidly Republican. They're surrounded by partisans who just tell them to fight nastier, fight harder. This is the doom loop. This is the escalating doom loop of we have to dominate the other side. And you know what that means? That means that people are willing to accept the breaking of democratic norms because winning is more important. They're gerrymandering their state. We got to undo our independent commission so we can gerrymander our state even harder. Where does that lead, right? Democracy is a system in which we have legitimate elections, in which we accept the legitimacy of outcomes, whether we win or lose. Okay, so now what would happen if we put in place fusion voting? This should be So these are older slides, but basically the idea is that if without fusion voting, there's very few Senate elections that are competitive. With fusion voting, you have now, you can imagine 3% fusion. Suddenly there's more elections that are competitive because there's that 3% that could endorse either Democrats or Republicans. 4% more competitive, 5% even more competitive. Similarly, with the House, and if you went up to even you could imagine even higher percent fusion parties. Again, it's the swing in the middle. Suddenly, there's more competition. That is good. There is more potential innovation. There's more opportunities for shifting coalitions. Now, this is just a prediction. We don't know because we haven't made it legal everywhere. But if you suddenly have a party that could endorse either Democrats or Republicans, that creates more potential swing in the election. That creates more dynamism. That creates potential for more factions that are reaching apart across parties. That creates more possibility for multi-partyism and more of a possible transition to proportional representation, which would be genuine multi-partyism, which I think is a good thing because we do not want to be stuck in this flattened, one-dimensional, two-party system with us versus them. And I don't see any other way out of that other than by changing the election rules a little bit to allow some new parties to get into the mix and to change the fray. Would it lead to polarization, or would it lead to, I don't know. I can't make any predictions about the future. It depends on who organizes and who gets involved. But what I do know is that they're looking at a lot of polling data that there are a lot of people who really don't feel either party represents them. There are a lot of people who feel like, they're more socially liberal, fiscally conservative, or maybe they're more socially conservative, economically liberal. Maybe they have other issues, and they are boxed out of the system. They can't bring that dimensionality to the system under the existing rules. What fusion does is it creates an opening. It says you can organize, you can now form a party, and you can push the two major parties to actually try to adopt. Right now, the two major parties are just stuck in the same, you're evil. No, you're evil. No, you're more evil. And that's where we are. And it's destroying our faith in democracy. It's allowing incredible liberalism under the guise of, well, Democrats are worse. And what happens when Democrats get back into power? I mean, anyway, that is my take.
All right. Thanks so much, everyone, for being here. It's been a great conference, great views. I think it's always really important when we start discussing any sort of voting reform of asking the question, like, what are we trying to accomplish? Right. And we can think about fusion voting in a couple ways. One is it's going to give you more expression on your ballot. And that's like de facto true, right? Because I have more choices. And we can make more choices in many different ways. I think many of us, right, those of us in Wisconsin, we might think that we're trying to achieve something to get us out of this kind of hostile, polarized environment, something that's going to depolarize, right? Something we have Tammy Baldwin, who doesn't represent a large portion of Wisconsin. We have Ron Johnson, who doesn't represent a large portion of Wisconsin. And instead, maybe we can have something that's more depolarized, more centrist. And so I think we want to ask the question then, if that's our goal, and I think for many of us that might be the goal, like, is fusion voting well positioned to achieve that? And so to answer that question, I think there's like three broad places we can look. So first is at the long ago historical record, the 19th century, which we heard about in the last panel and a bit today. We look at the contemporary experience in New York. And then we also can try to use just like political theory and political economy more generally to think about what the prospective effects might be. My reading of the evidence in all three of these is that we should expect little to no effect on depolarization. And if anything, the effect will pull outwards to more polarization. And so let's start with the 19th century experience. We have this broad coalition building at this time, right? We have the Free Soilists, we have populists, we have abolitionists. But again, this is in the era of the pre-Australian ballot. And once again, as I asked in my question, you carry to the poll place with you a blue ballot or a green ballot or a red ballot, and that is observed by party bosses who can give out favors. These are robust and rich patronage systems. And so at the same time we end fusion voting, we're also ending this system. And so disentangling, I think, is very difficult. We see this massive decrease in electoral engagement. Voting rates go from about 90% in the late 1890s down to 40 to 50% by the 1920s, right? Because you can no longer be observed how you vote. So I think it's really hard to actually disentangle anything about fusion from that era. Second, we look to New York, right? The one state that really has a robust fusion apparatus. We have not seen a center party emerge in New York. There's no depolarizing party in New York. We have the Working Families Party. And, I think they'll say they're trying to pull a different dimension, but most people would say they're to the left of the Democrats. We have the Conservative Party to the right of the Republicans. These are forces pulling us apart. So we don't see depolarization effects. And we also do see transactional politics. So the Liberal Party, the Independence parties were effectively trading their ballot lines in exchange for patronage, in exchange for contracts, in exchange for favors. So it's not a great experience there. And so we can turn to theory, right? Ask the question, like, what do we think as in terms of political theory? Both Dan and Lee brought up this kind of one-dimensional policy space, which does seem to describe most voters. If we know how you think about one issue, we can actually make a very accurate prediction about other issues. Not for all voters, but for most voters. And so what's the best case for fusion voting in this? What's the best case? Is that a center party emerges, kind of what Lee showed us here, and that is pivotal in the election. What does that mean? Well, we now need 3% of voters or 5% of voters who are going to follow that center party's line. Who are these voters? If they're already voting Republican, why are they going to now switch to the Democratic candidates when the center party endorses them, or vice versa? You might say they're low information voters, but if they're low information voters, how do they know that the center party is in fact a center party? So in New York, people are not very good at placing the Working Family Party on the ideological axis. They think it's between the Democrats and the Republicans. The Independence Party, 85% of people who registered with the Independence Party thought they were registering as independents. Right? And so if these are low information voters, how do they learn about the effect of this party? And so, right, we already have that candidates have strong incentives to move towards the center in general elections, right? You know you have to avoid being primaries. You have to move to the left in a Democratic primary, to the right in a Republican primary. But there's already strong incentives to move towards the center. And it's not clear what another party's endorsement is going to do here, why that's going to be convincing to these voters. And so I think the real question we should be asking ourselves is like, what are we trying to achieve? And what is the precise mechanism that's going to get us from introducing fusion voting to this depolarization? And to me, I don't think the evidence isn't there in any of these three contexts. So thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Those were all really interesting. I want to give very brief reflections, have some questions, but then leave lots of time for audience questions as well. So let me briefly say I grew up in upstate New York. I've voted on fusion ballots. I've seen these minor parties. And indeed, until I went to college and really realized that you actually wouldn't have this elsewhere. But you know, my impression of the New York politics is also not that it was so much better than the politics I saw elsewhere in the country. So you know, I think that gave me a little bit of skepticism. The other when we reference the history and talk about introducing new dimensions, I think you know one of the classic examples of it, the biggest example pointed to is the precursors of the Republican Party, sort of putting slavery on the agenda at a time when you know the Whigs and Democrats weren't that interested in talking about it. And I think, you know, it at least seems reasonable to me to think it did put it on the agenda. They didn't seem to make people like each other better. And then we had a civil war. And well, I'm very happy that ended slavery. I'm hoping we don't have a civil war now. And so, you know, that I wonder if that is at least necessarily a great direction to be heading. Now, this may be a very different context for fusion, and it's maybe not even really the same thing as the sort of party ticket era where, yeah, you could vote for anybody. There was no official ballot. I'm not sure that is the same as, you know, what I grew up with in New York. But, you know, I don't know that history makes me feel better about it either. Okay, so the last thing is, I think, and we've heard reference to this, especially the first panel. I think a lot of political scientists think that we need stronger parties. That one of the problems with American politics compared to elsewhere in the world is that we may have a lot of partisanship, but we have weak parties. But I think to me that raises the question of whether fusion would strengthen parties or weaken parties. Now, maybe it's wrong to think we should be strengthening parties, but I suppose it's not totally clear to me why fusion would strengthen them if that's a goal. But I also have heard that reference. So I think that's the first question I want to put to put to really, I don't know, this is directed at anybody in particular, but would fusion strengthen parties, weaken parties, and is that a case for or against or nothing? And
Man,
go ahead,
I'm
please.
happy to jump in. So I actually think the conversation between strong versus weak parties is extremely confused, and what we should think about is the difference between healthy and unhealthy parties. And what I mean by healthy parties are parties that do real organizing, have real presence, have real structures that connect with, that actually serve the intermediary function that parties are supposed to serve. So this is different than a hierarchical party. I think sometimes we get confused that versus how centralized or decentralized should parties be. I think a healthy party should be rooted. Now, one thing that fusion voting does encourage is it encourages people who are starting these new parties to actually do some real organizing, to actually show up and be in places and mobilize voters. And, I think there are some voters out there who feel torn, might vote Republican, but they really don't like the direction of the Republican Party. They really don't think that Trump and all of that, what I would consider to be insanity, and I think a lot of people agree, is really the right direction for the Republican Party. Right now, what can they do? They can try to run in a primary and lose, but let's imagine that they could organize a center-right party. This fusion voting gives them a reason to organize that party, so then they command a ballot line and they can say, look, Democrats, we're not Democrats. We don't like the direction of our party. We will endorse you, and these are the things that we want. And by the way, for existing MAGA Republicans, if you want to win elections in the state of Wisconsin, you need to think seriously about the Nazis that are, embedding in your party, and maybe do a little bit of house cleaning there. But without that, without the fusion option, where is the organizing coming from? Where is the leverage coming from? And that is the key issue, I think.
Yeah, I want to totally chime in there because right now our parties, the dominant parties, don't do any organizing. They ask for your money and they run television ads. And their television ads are insulting and stupid. And they make people dislike politics intensely or hate it, as E.J. Dionne wrote in the title of his book some years ago. It is not that third political parties are virtuous and whatever, but they are smaller organizations. And how they mobilize people is by talking to them because they don't have a recognizable brand. And right now, it is, I think, a criminal offense to me to organize a third political party and draw off votes and make them inconsequential. Everyone has a right for their vote to have a consequential effect. I don't think that sitting out is the only way to waste a vote. I think that making someone's vote inconsequential is wasting their vote. And fusion is one thing. IRV is another way that can enable a vote that you cast on a third party line because someone knocked on your door and talked to you to have a consequential outcome in the election. And I think we should not minimize this. I think having politics not be something that you simply encounter through your TikTok and your TV, but through someone who knocks on your door and expresses concern for you and listens to what you have to say. These are all super important right now because people don't trust politics.
Wait, hold on. Chuck Schumer just asked for $3.
Did he? Yes, you should give it to him anyway.
So
Just $3. That's all we need. But it's
well, I think that actually leads me into I'm at least New Yorker by birth, and so I want to ask about New York. And then you studied New York here. To what extent have we seen, has fusion done any of these things that have been talked about? Like, are people happier with politics in New York or feel more?
Yeah, I guess I don't know specifically about like, how the public feels there. But I am kind of torn because on the one, I like this discussion about thinking about healthy parties. And when you just think about it, like having it's like third parties can hold the major parties accountable, right? Because as of right now, the only way to hold them accountable is either to sit out or I mean, there's really no options, right?
Yes.
So I like the idea. That's kind of like why my research has focused so much on third parties. And I like to think about third parties as a good thing, and particularly on the side of voter behavior, on voter attitudes. But then on the other hand, when I'm doing my research and like what are the actual effects, and in particular, I got into it thinking about polarization because when I went into grad school in the early 2000s, that was kind of the big thing, and we still talk about it.
It's much bigger.
So when you think about polarization, I'm just seeing that like in New York State, like what are the third parties that form? I mean, they tend to be towards the extremes because they're reaching out to voters that really care about politics and that really care about an issue. They would tend to be more ideological, and tend to come from one side or the other. Versus the moderates tend to be less politically engaged, less involved in politics, less likely to turn out and vote. So it's not surprising that there aren't like political entrepreneurs starting a centrist party because there's just not that. I mean, there may be a demand, but how many of those demanders are actually going to vote though? And then that's I think the harder thing for the centrist parties too. So it all comes down to like, in theory, yes, third parties are great. In practice, given that the third parties that form will tend to be towards the extremes, that's where I'm seeing that it's probably not going to contribute to moderation.
Well, look, I mean, historically that is the case because the Democrat and the Republican Party were in the closer to the center. They've pulled apart. Now, what Fusion can do and what third parties do is they organize the part of the electorate that feels currently unrepresented. Historically, the center has been well represented by our two major parties, which were much more center oriented until the 2010s. I think a lot of moderates in both parties have thought, well, we'll just fight within our party to bring our party back to the center. And I think as that becomes no longer a possibility, particularly in the Republican Party, Julie asked about asymmetry earlier, that is where there is an opportunity. I mean, politics changes, right? I mean, there's no one rule. Just because something is polarizing in one period, it might be an opportunity to create a center in another period. Everything is dynamic. Everything is a response to what happened before. And you can go back to earlier eras and, some eras, the parties, the Liberal Party in New York was a long-standing center party that endorsed both Democrats and Republicans, in a different era. So, right. Politics is a complex, dynamic system that is always changing. And the key is how do you keep it from spiraling out of control? How do you keep it from a self-reinforcing doom loop? And if you have a party system problem, which we do, you need a party system solution.
I want to let me touch very briefly on the, I think this is some of what you said touched on the low information idea that Nate mentioned. So I want to add how that plays in here, particularly, I think there's political science. Literature has generally suggested that centrist voters tend to be more low information, and also that what we call moderates from surveys may not necessarily be one position, but maybe different combinations of extremes that don't fit a single dimension well, and so they sort of get placed in the middle. How does that play in here? What implications does that have for how fusion would work?
Do you want me to answer that? Or were you directing that to Nate or me?
I'll give Nate. Since Nate hasn't said anything, I'll give Nate.
I mean, because
there's a chance.
I have thoughts.
I'll let you rebut me afterwards. So, I think that the evidence really does suggest that you have low information voters, right? The swing voters are oftentimes these low information voters, and so that to me begs the question: if we're going to have a depolarizing centrist party, like, how do those voters have enough information about what that party is? right? You can call yourself the centrist party, and this is indeed what the Independence Party tried to do in New York. They call themselves the Independence Party, and they use that again for kind of patronage. We now need these low information voters who can't, decide between the Republican Democratic candidate to now learn enough that this party is a credible signal about what I care about. That seems like a lot more information that they have to actually have, right? And if they're just following the name, then what stops the proliferation of the center party and the center-right party and the center-left party and the Independence Party and the moderate party? And it's a signal jamming. And what can we actually learn from that? That's my concern.
I mean, so the signal jamming is a common thing that people worry about with fusion. And you have a lot of experience in New York. There's not been a signal jamming problem.
But in New York, right, we have the signals are coming from the flanks. They're not coming from the center.
Right.
So there's not a signal jamming.
But you actually have to, I mean, actually organizing a party is a lot of work. Right. I mean, you're exactly what you're saying. Like to build that party, to reach enough voters, to organize enough voters, to tell them to vote on that party line. That requires like real work, and that's the kind of work that we should actually want in our democracy. Is actually reaching out to some of these voters who have tuned out of politics because all they see is the same, talking heads screaming at each other on negative advertisements, and they say, what's the point? I can't vote for a party I care about. So why am I even wasting my time? Which is totally reasonable. I mean, most votes don't matter in this country, and most people got other stuff to do. So I agree. There's a lot of voters who are low information because they're disengaged because where does it start from? The U.S. has among the lowest voter turnout in the world because we have very few competitive elections and we have only two parties. In other countries with more parties, there is higher turnout because more votes matter because the more elections are competitive mostly because of proportional representation, but also because you have more parties that are trying to reach different segments of the electorate. Right now you have Democrats and Republicans who are just organizing the other side is evil. Well, that's not inspiring to a lot of people. But if you can mobilize some people to say, hey, let's vote on this party line. And yes, I mean, I agree. There's a lot of people who are independents and moderates and who are just had these sort of heterodox views. But that is somewhat downstream from the political competition that people are witnessing. So if people get to witness different types of political competition, different parties sending different signals, people can pick up on those signals and locate themselves. I mean, you think of it, it's like a map. You need more data points to locate yourself. And I think there are a lot of high information voters who are dissatisfied with their party and who feel incredibly powerless. And remember, the power of fusion is you don't need to organize a party that displaces one of the two major parties. You don't need to get to 35%. You can get to 3 or 4% and have a very powerful impact on increasing the competition and potentially the dimensionality and dynamism and fluidity of our politics.
So Levi, if I could just ask briefly, because you said that, do you not see the Women's Equality Party that I think I have the name right, that Andrew Cuomo set up, or the Tax Cut Now Party, I think is a party at the 90s, a Republican set up to sort of have extra ballot lines, at least in my understanding. Do you, or for that matter, the Independence Party, which made reference, it seemed to, and the Liberal Party at the end of its time when it was basically handing out lines for office. Do you not see those as
was the
example
election better because Cuomo was able to run in the general election?
I'm not
more competitive.
I'm not trying to ask more broadly. I'm just trying to ask at the point that this hasn't happened at all in New York. If that hasn't happened, at least as little.
Actually, I think we shouldn't be bouncing back and forth. And I have to say that I'm feeling really uncomfortable with the way that we're talking about New York. And I'm feeling uncomfortable, A, because we are generalizing the picture of New York politics to what fusion politics would look like in other states. And I just don't think that you can do that.
Yeah.
And B, I am extremely uncomfortable with the idea that all the Working Families Party, which is what came out of the decline of the Liberal Party, has done is get patronage. I'm really and that it doesn't mobilize voters. I'm just wondering, Dan Cantor, do you have anything that you could say about the Working Families Party, which you probably know?
So I need to say, I did not say the Working Families Party was doing patronage, the Liberal Party was doing patronage, and that was the decline. So I did not say that, or if I did, that was an overspeak. So that was not at all.
Okay, but nonetheless,
Dan can provide some history of what actually happened.
I mean, I'll talk in a minute, but yeah, there's minor parties. They are a lot of work and they're a lot of fun because you get to bargain around policy if you actually have a base. You need an actual base of human beings. This is the crucial thing. So all of those parties you mentioned, those Women's Equality Party, and there were no meetings to go to. They were just a label on the ballot. That is not the same as a party. Party are citizens who share a set of values, who go to meetings. It's really boring a lot of times. But sometimes it gets to be a lot of fun as well. And people like participating in things like that. So there was zero patronage. We didn't want jobs. They weren't offering any. But we wanted was the ability to bargain for a set of policy gains. The best example, actually, I thought of it just a minute ago. In 2008, there was a fiscal crisis in America. People will remember this. 2008, yeah. 48 states cut their state budgets pretty substantially. I'm sure there were state lawmakers in Wisconsin that had to do some serious budget cutting. There were 2 states that raised taxes on the wealthiest citizens, Connecticut and New York. And it was a direct result of the minor parties in those 2 states that said to the leadership of their major party partner, no, we are going to not allow you to do that. If you do, we will have to run spoilers. We'll do this, we'll do that. That is the power of a minor party. That is the power of fusion. But it has no power if there are no people involved, right? You got to be able to show that people show up. And whoever said it, you do not have to be that large. You're not trying to win the election on the minor party. We're going to hear later, because I'm going to give some of my time to Dale Schultz, former majority leader of Wisconsin Senate. You're a 3%, 4%, 5% party. You are a kingmaker in a state, particularly one that's close. New York isn't that close, though there are districts that are very close, even in every state. And in those districts, you get a lot of respect. Better to be respected in politics than loved. So the major parties hate them, but the voters really enjoy them, and it's always better to be respected. So I don't want to take too much.
So, and I do want to be clear that I also was not talking about the Working Families Party, in at least my question there. So I want to give you guys a chance to ask questions of each other, and then audience questions. Do any of you have questions you would like to ask of another, or of the whole panel? All right. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Over to audience questions. Yeah, I think you had your hand up there first.
Thanks. I have a question for Professor Dish about the historical episode of the late 19th century has been the one that we seem to be talking about around banning fusion voting. I'm curious about the relevance of the first and second Red Scares, which sort of excluded broadly or sought to exclude broadly from the political discourse parties on the left from participation, whether that had any implications for how parties saw their sort of letting smaller parties or factions into the political discourse through fusion voting, or that was all settled before the first and second Red Scares.
To be honest, I do not know if that had any bearing on, and I'd be happy if anyone wants to fill that in. As Andy Craig said earlier, the fusion ban contexts were very state specific. It is not the case that you cannot disentangle the relationship between the shift to the Australian ballot from fusion bans, because it was mostly not simultaneous, and fusion continued to flourish after the introduction of the Australian ballot. And so what typically happened was that when the larger of the two dominant parties, which had been suffering from fusions between the second major party and usually the populace, but there were other third parties as well that could help that second major party win. When the other of the two major parties had enough strength, they would ban fusion. And it happened much more slowly in places like Kansas, where the Populist Party was stronger. And so it really was a political dynamic less than an ideological dynamic. Now, how much of that had to do in Milwaukee, Jeff will remember the details here maybe a little bit better than I do. But in Milwaukee, Milwaukee had a really strong Labor Party. And some attacks on third political parties that were before the fusion ban, but had to do with introducing the Australian ballot, were a reaction to the strength of the Labor Party in Milwaukee. And that was in the 1870s. So I would not be surprised if there is a link there with a Red Scare. Yes.
Okay. Questions? Nathan?
Can you talk about what the bargaining process looks like if there's a major party that is not responsive to a minor party that has been in coalition, and they start to get towards parity, and what the nomination bargaining looks like in that case?
Are you asking me?
It could be anybody. Yeah.
Bargaining with the a major party. What happened when, let's say, Working Family and Democrats get to 50.5%?
That doesn't happen. Minor party is still minor part. If you get that high, there have been cases where the WP is strong enough in the district that. So for people know who Brad Lander is, he got famous he came up through the Working Families Party, and the Democrats fused on him. Like, it was clear that he was going to be our person, and he was so good that they wanted him. Now, he was actually a registered. We don't encourage people to register as Working Families Party members by and large, because the action is in the Democratic primary in New York City. Outstate, we do. So, politics is like it's a dynamic. It's human beings. But if there's talent, you'll find people. When people would describe themselves, "Oh, I'm a Working Families Democrat," we would be very happy. Just as the Tea Party was happy when people would describe themselves as Tea Party Republicans. And the challenge is, can a party it's not moderation. This is like completely wrong. It's representation, left, right, and center. In a fusion system, the people who are not being organized can organize if they feel like there's a gap. This is what Lee was trying to talk about. United Wisconsin's got a giant opportunity and a giant challenge. If they win their litigation, then they got to actually build the thing such that voters feel like, I want to be with those people. So it's just a rules change. It's neutral. Everybody gets to play, but it leads to more representation and hopefully more accurate representation.
More questions? Yeah. So that's all right.
Hi, I'm Mike Leisure. I'm in the School of Medicine, actually, so you might wonder why I'm here, but I'm also engaged in political reform at the same time. I had a question. So thinking about this whole idea of reforming parties, improving parties through fusion voting as one reform. What the other thread I'm gathering is when it comes to instant runoff voting, ranked choice, that's more focused on maybe giving independent, kind of individual candidates maybe have a little more agency is maybe the thread I'm hearing. But I wanted to hear y'all's thoughts on kind of like those two reforms, and like I'm talking to Lee in particular, but it could extend to anyone, because I know Lee's kind of shifted in this over time based on what I've heard. Actually instantly read the article where you shifted your take on it. So
yes, if anybody wants my take on how I changed my views on ranked choice voting, you can read a article on my Substack, how I updated my views on ranked choice voting. Actually, a paper that Nate wrote was actually one of many papers that helped to convince me that ranked choice voting was kind of a nothing burger. But the big point about why I think, to me, fusion is superior to ranked choice voting is because fusion encourages parties that form and organize and mobilize people and stay around from election to election. With ranked choice voting, it's great. Candidates are not spoilers if that's what you're worried about. Most elections are so uncompetitive that the only spoilage is that they're not competitive. But there are some, for particularly for local elections that are nonpartisan, I think, you can do ranked choice voting. That makes sense there for some primaries, maybe. But it is a candidate-oriented election system in which the goal is to prevent splitting of the vote among candidates. But candidates run, and then after they run, they go do something else. Parties stick around. And they build and engage and mobilize and energize people and try to build power that comes from having the collectiveness of the conspiracy of a party, to reference what Seth said earlier.
May I say one follow-up thing? Is there a little bit of a chicken and the egg thing now in the sense that in order to affect the parties and affect the different candidates and leaders? And in fact, that's one of the issues that I have as a voter thinking about reform design. I think there are some good candidates out there, some good elected officials, but I think there's quite small and group of people that really would inspire me. I'd go if you're going to get more individual, which one do you put first, or hear them simultaneously to then garner out more effective?
Well, yes, politics right now is, it's always been a rough business, but so it's a real shit sandwich to run for public office. And it shouldn't be that. And, a lot of good people are not running for public office. A lot of good people are leaving public office. And, this is another problem of the crisis of hyper-partisan polarization in the doom loop is, who wants to be in elected office these days? You face threats of violence. It's all partisan screaming. And the pay is lousy. So, it is really hard to get good people to go into politics. And that's a broader issue of how we value politicians and how we value politics. And there's so much anti-politics. But, yeah, it's a real problem. And, my hope in working on election reform is that by changing the way our electoral system works, we can make politics more creative, more collaborative, more engaging, more energizing, and actually, draw some more inspiring leaders into politics.
Yeah. So I kind of lump a lot of these reforms together for me, theoretically. So for me, ranked choice voting, fusion, electoral fusion, and then low ballot access requirements all kind of accomplish the same thing, and I think have very similar effects. Because what do all those things do? They increase the chances of a third-party candidate, especially for ranked choice and fusion, getting on the ballot and then winning votes. And then why I also lump in ballot access, because, even for ranked choice voting, that can help minor parties, continue living on, because they're able to win the votes to gain ballot access. Because a lot of these ballot access things are also written in terms of performance at the polls.
Yeah.
So that's, so for me, I kind of lump all those reforms together and see a lot of similarities when the underlying dynamic is, what reforms help third parties get on ballot and then win votes. And ultimately, their ability to do those things impacts how much they can influence the major parties, right? So that's me, just how I lump them together.
So I would say I lump them together too, but in a different way, in that I think ranked choice voting should be called instant runoff voting, because there's many different ranked choice procedures. And fusion voting, as you've heard now, I think they're both going to be very minor and very ineffective reforms. And maybe the way to think of it is, suppose you have Tammy Baldwin and Ron Johnson running against each other, right? Wisconsin, we split right down the middle. We can hope for this third party under fusion to emerge and have some signaling value between the two of them. You still have Tammy Baldwin and Ron Johnson running, right? I think what you're interested in is also this. Sorry, I don't mean to put words in your mouth. Right? Can we have a reasonable, not trying to add to the reasonable, but someone who's at the center of Wisconsin, can they run and contest the election? And the answer is no, right? You're a spoiler. You're a third party. You can't do so. And under ranked choice voting, you can vote for that person. They're limited in the first round. They're gone. There's other election systems that can do this. We can look at actually majority comparisons. You can rank the candidates. And now suppose we have someone who's at the center. And now you ask people, let's rank Ron Johnson, center, Tammy Baldwin. I'm going to say that's about half the electorate. Half are going to say Tammy Baldwin, center candidate Ron Johnson, and some of them are split center first. We can actually look at the head-to-head comparisons. And this is called majority voting or Condorcet voting. Actually allow that person to actually contest and win an election Under ranked choice voting, again, instant runoff voting, that person has no chance of winning the election. Under fusion voting, I'd be so happy if it works. I don't think the evidence is there.
All right. Over there, I think we got a couple of you guys. I'll try to get everybody in.
Yeah, so my question is kind of related to some of those graphs earlier about like political polarization, how the Senate candidates no longer overperform how the presidential candidates do in their seats, or with House candidates, etc. I guess my question is whether or not you think this is really due to electoral law, or whether or not this is just a change in our political culture. There did used to be a lot of candidates who would overperform, but the difference is, well, even if electoral law doesn't change, they lose now. No one overperforms by more than like 10% in Ohio, like, or other states. You saw like John Tester and like Sherrod Brown, and you've seen some like classical like Republicans who used to overperform. Now they don't. It seems like in our political culture, independent of what the law is, there actually aren't that many swing voters right anymore, or people who are willing to look past the candidates no matter how much they go to differentiate themselves. I'm just wondering if you have like any data to add or like anything you'd have to say about that, or if you think this is like an incorrect characterization. I'm curious what you think more in general.
I mean, right. And our political culture has changed. It's changed tremendously over the last 2.5 decades. Our politics has become much more nationalized. Our parties have become much more polarized. And the Democrats have given up on rural and small town America, and Republicans have given up on urban and professional educated class suburban America for the most part. And that is a real problem. That is a problem that is causing all this division, but it's a problem because of how we do elections in this country. So, in 2000, didn't matter, right? The parties were too close to the middle. That's why you had parties on the extremes. Now, the parties have pulled apart and everything is nationalized and everything is flattened. So the question we need to ask is, what can we do to increase some of the dimensionality, increase some of the play, increase some of the resilience, increase some of the fluidity in that system? And by creating reforms that allow new parties to organize and reach out to voters who are left out of the system, who are disaffected by the system, who are frustrated by the system, and say, hey, we can organize and we can change the dynamism of this system, that at least creates a possibility. Can I guarantee that it is going to work? That depends on what people do with it, right? You can get into the University of Wisconsin on a scholarship, but if you don't attend any of your classes, that scholarship is worthless.
You won't have any followers.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I just want to feed off what you said, Lee. I think people are hungry for change. I think we need more competition. And I think the Republican Party is imploding. And I think now the Democrats are going to probably implode after what happened with Chuck Schumer. So I think I think the time right now is ripe for either fusion or ranked choice voting or something to give the power back to the voters.
So do you have a question?
No, that was more of a comment.
All right. Questions? Sure. Over here.
Yes.
Really quick, I like the whole multidimensionality. I believe that super doom party doom loop where it's just all gonna get eaten up and collapsed by the major parties and just almost like contribute to more partisanship.
You mean that we passed the event horizon and we're all in the black hole?
Kind of.
Yeah. Well, then we're all fucked. So what's the twist?
Right. It's kind of the whole conflict extension, just like with new.
Yeah, but I mean, I think there are issues. There are a lot of 70-30 issues out there. And a lot of floating voter groups who could be wrested free. I don't think we're past the event horizon. Yeah, but if we are, then what are we doing?
Sorry. So this is not directed at anyone in particular, but as a person who was born in 2002, I don't think this will come as any surprise that people don't really read anymore. And that's what all four of you are kind of getting at, is this idea of flow engagement or disillusion with the system. In my view, as someone who's raised in part by the internet, is it pessimistic to say that procedural reforms are a drop in the bucket with a population that has become accustomed to partial attention and instant gratification through short form content?
I mean, bring back the color coded ballots,
Right.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big issue, but yeah.
I don't know. Zoran Mandani did just fine. He managed to mobilize a bunch of new voters using the things that speak to you and I have no idea where to find.
All right, we got time for one last question. So over there, let's try to make it brief, if possible.
Yeah, Kurt Bolton, Wisconsin Green Party. I look at the data that was presented, and I think I can see that gerrymandering is a big factor in this whole thing. So I would like to, you can tell me that's fine. I would like you to explain it to me instead of just telling me no, because I'm wondering if
I'm in 1 minute, but it's because of the sorting of the parties. Doesn't matter. Like when you have single member districts, if Democrats live in one part of the state and Republicans live in the other part of the state, gerrymandering has a minor effect on that. But mostly it's the way that the parties have just sorted geographically. Is the Senate gerrymandered? No.
But weren't your graphs the same for the Senate?
Yeah. So it's not gerrymandering. If it was gerrymandering, you'd see it much worse in the House, right?
you can't gerrymander a Senate.
Exactly. That's the pitch.
So I think like a lot of times people say gerrymandering is a symptom, not the cause.
Yes,
partisan.
exactly.
All right, I think that was the last question we had time for. Thank you all. And I know there's some more questions, so hopefully you could ask them during the break.